Good morning. This is Mrs. Standridge. I'm glad you could join me for another episode of Elijah of Buxton. We're going to be reading chapter 19 today. Yesterday we left off with someone had grabbed Elijah while he was trying to eavesdrop on a meeting that all the adults were attending. So let's see if we can find out what's going on with Elijah now. Chapter 19, a ball starts rolling. Whatever snatched me up was starting to get tired. The way it had me mashed up against it, I could feel its heart flopping round in its chest like a fish that had got throwed up on the land. It commenced breathing hard and finally dropped me on the ground. Soon as it let me go, I forgot all that nonsense about mice and cats, and I tried to light out for the trees. I didn't get far, 'cause a root seemed like it reached up and tripped me back to the ground. You'd have thought with as many times as I've been stumbled up and throwed to the ground, I'd have learnt to keep my mouth shut once I was about to hit. But that's another one of those lessons that don't seem to stick, 'cause soon as I banged down, I got a mouthload of twigs and dirt and dried up leaves. I felt round to see if maybe I could get a hold of a chunking stone and go down fighting, but my fingers weren't running over nothing but more roots and twigs. I turned round to see what it was that had snatched me, and saw a sight that terrified me to my soul. 'Twas Mr. Leroy, and he looked just like someone that had died but didn't know it. He was holding on to his left arm and breathing hard. He said, "Elijah, I needs you." Spit the dirt and leaves out of my mouth and told him, "I'm sorry, Mr. Leroy, I didn't know he was going to steal your money. I swear I didn't know, sir." Mr. Leroy held up his hand so's I'd give him a chance to catch on to his breathing. He said, "Boy, I know you didn't know nothing. Ain't no one's fault but my own and that thieving fool's. But I do hope you gonna help me out. Elijah, I'm lost. I ain't got no one else what I can turn to." Mr. Leroy leaned up against a tree and kept having a hard time finding his breath. I stood up and went over to him and said, "Mr. Leroy, I don't care what you and Pa say. I know it's 'cause of me that all this happened, and I'll do anything you want to try to help, sir. Anything. All you got to do is tell me." What Mr. Leroy said made my blood run cold and my legs get shakety. He said, "I got to go to that village in Michigan and see if any of that money's left. And if it ain't none left, I'm a find Zechariah and shoot him down for stealing my dreams of getting my family out. I'm a look him in the eye and make sure he die a terrible death." I'd heard tell about people that you could look at and see death was walking right next to 'em, and when I looked at Mr. Leroy and heard the hard, cold way he was saying those words, I knowed what that meant. Some of those words might be freed people prettifying things up, but some of it was real. It was easy to see that death had its arm round Mr. Leroy, propping him up, taking its time, waiting to walk with him into Michigan to grab a hold of the preacher. Mr. Leroy put his hand on his side, and I saw he was wearing the preacher's fancy holster and mystery pistol. All of a sudden, I didn't feel so brave. "But, sir, I can't help with that. I don't know where he's at." Mr. Leroy said, "I need you to come with me, 'cause I can't read, 'Lijah. Plus, I ain't comforted dealing with white folks like you is. I ain't got the intention of letting no man, not even no white man, pull me off from what I got to do, and I need you to help." "But, Mr. Leroy, there's slave catchers over in Michigan. How we going to stop someone from trying to kidnap us?" "Boy, the way you talks, no one in the world gonna think you ever been no slave. All they got to do is look at you. They know you born free. And if we got to use this pistol, then we got to use this pistol." "So does that mean you're going to force me to come with you, sir?" "I'm terrible sorry, Elijah, but a ball done started rolling downhill what ain't going to be stopped. We both going to Michigan." "Then that means I ain't got no choice, sir?" "I'm afeared not, son." I told him, "Great! I was just making sure, Mr. Leroy. I know if Ma and Pa found out I went to Michigan on my own accord, they'd skin me alive once I got back. This way I can tell 'em, and tell 'em true, that I got kidnapped and I ain't going to be in near as much trouble. Thank you, sir." Mr. Leroy said, I do hope you ain't going to be talking no spools of nonsense whilst we goin'. I really can't take that, Elijah. I think it'd be best if we goes along being quiet. Yes, sir. Mr. Leroy said, I borrowed a horse from the barn. We gonna make good time. We walked deeper into the woods. Jingle Boy's reins were tied to a tree. Mr. Leroy climbed on his back and reached down to pull me up. I began seeing that Mr. Leroy hadn't done no planning about this. It was like Pa had said, he warn't seeing things the way they were. He was still seeing things the way he wanted them to be. I said, Mr. Leroy, we can't just go right off to Michigan like this, sir. Cooter's ma's expecting me to go to her house tonight. He turned round and said, So? If things go good, you's going to be back tomorrow, day after at the most. Well, sir, if they don't show up tonight, Well, sir, if I don't show up tonight, they're going to think something's happened to me, and I ain't meaning to be disrespectful, sir, but folks are saying you lost your mind and are out in the woods wandering about chunking axes at the moon. If they put those two things together, they're going to figure you grabbed me and we're heading to Michigan. And Pa likes you a powerful lot, sir, but if he thinks you kidnapped me, he's going to come ripping out after us like his hair's afire. Then there's going to be some big problems, and we ain't going to be able to catch a hold of the preacher. Mr. Leroy reined in Jingle Boy and said, That makes sense. What you think we should do? Let me go back to Cooter's home and tell Mrs. Bixby that Ma and Pa changed their mind and that I can't spend the night there. That way Ma and Pa will think I'm sleeping at Cooter's, and Cooter's Ma will think I'm sleeping at home. It won't be no big problem that I miss school tomorrow. Ma and Pa will figure I'm there. Then with tomorrow being Friday, I got to do my chores at the barn right after classes, and then they'll think I went fishing. So won't no one know I'm kidnapped till after 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. By that time we'll be back. Won't we? We can't be back no later than Saturday, sir. I got a big examination on Latin verbs Monday, and I ain't done the proper amount of studying yet. Mr. Leroy said, I knowed it was the right thing to bring you along. You got a real keen mind, Elijah. I figure you can think us through near about anything. I'm powerful sorry I got to drag you into this, son. You keep in mind you saving me, but you gonna have to work hard on cutting down on some of that talking you like to do. I showed Mr. Leroy the quickest way to get to Cooter's through the woods. Before I jumped off Jingle Boy's back, Mr. Leroy turned round to look me hard in the face. You know if you was to take off, there ain't nothing I could do. You tell me now, Elijah. You tell me so's I ain't gonna waste no more time waiting on you. Is you gonna come back? There any need for me to wait, or should I just leave now, alone? I raised my right hand and told him, Mr. Leroy, sir, I swear on my mama's head that I'm coming right back. I slid off Jingle Boy and ran out of the woods and down the road to Cooter's home. The screen door was shut, but the main door was open. I knocked. Mrs. Bixby held the door open and said, That sure warn't long. I tried to look sad and said, No, ma'am, folks warn't too much in the mood for talking. She said, So what they gonna do? They gonna try to run that thief down? Uh-oh. I said, They made me leave afore I found out. She laughed and said, That's good. I was kind of surprised your folks let you go to that meeting in the first place. She looked over in the corner where Cooter was still mashing his nose up against the walls. She said to me and him both, But, Elijah, you's a whole lot more grown than some other folks your age. I said, Ma and Pa changed their mind, ma'am. I can't stay with you all tonight. I got to go back home and go to school tomorrow and go do my chores right after class and then go fishing. I'll probably be out of everyone's sight till near about 8 tomorrow evening, maybe a little later if the fishing don't go good. And judging by the way it went the other day, I might even be later than that. So no one should think I got kidnapped and come looking for me till probably a whole lot later than most times. I tried to look sadder. She said, That's fine, Elijah. You can stay on some other night. Your bag's where you left it at. I walked into Cooter's room to get my bag, but I reached inside and got a paper and a pencil to write a note. I went over to the window so's the full moonlight would let me see. I wrote, Dear Cooter, how are you? fine, I hope. I'm doing good, except that Mr. Leroy's gone and kidnapped me and took me fighting all the way to Michigan. We're looking for the preacher and Mr. Leroy's money. He ain't crazy nor trying to hit the man in the moon. He just wants his family back. I begged him not to take me, but he say I got to go. We going to be coming back tomorrow round supper time. Tell my ma and pa they do not got to send no money, and they do not got to worry, because Mr. Leroy swore he is going to take good care of me. Cooter's ma called out from the parlor, Elijah, what you doing? It don't take that long to get no bag. I said, I'm sorry, Mrs. Bixby. I was writing Cooter a note to say I'll see him tomorrow, since I ain't allowed to talk to him. She said to Cooter, see, how come you ain't more like that boy? I had to finish quick. Sincerely, your friend, Elijah Freeman. I read what I'd writ and figured I'd best put in one more part. P.S. Don't give this to my ma and pa until Saturday morning, else Mr. Leroy will cut my throat and bleed me like a pig. I had to put the throat-cutting part in, 'cause every once in a while my luck ain't real good, and whilst I can most times count on Cooter to do what's wrong, he might have got afeard and tried to do what was right with this. But if he thought I was going to get bleeded like a pig, I know he'd do what was wrong and wouldn't tell no one. I went back into their parlor and said to Mrs. Bixby, Ma'am, can I give this note to Cooter? She said, Go head on, Elijah, then hurry home. Tell your ma I ax about her. Yes, ma'am. I went to Cooter about as close as I could get and said, Cooter, this here note's for you. I put the note in his hand. Long as she was in the room, Cooter was real good at doing everything his ma told him to do, and he warn't about to move his nose out of that corner. He looked at me from the side of his eyes, and I blinked twice at him, and he blinked twice back at me. I felt better, 'cause that meant he knowed that note was powerful important and needed to be studied hard. I said, Thank you kindly, Mrs. Bixby, and good night. Good night, Elijah. Then she said to Cooter, Where's your manners at? Say good night to Elijah. Cooter kept his nose plumb in that corner and called out, Good night, Eli. Good night, Cooter. I left the Bixby home and started down the road toward my own home. Soon as I was far enough along that I knowed Mrs. Bixby couldn't see me, I cut into the woods and headed back to where I'd left Mr. Leroy. He didn't smile or nothing, but I could see it was a weight off his mind to see me. He said, I knowed you was a good man, Elijah. He reached down and pulled me up onto Jingle Boy. I wrapped my arms around Mr. Leroy's waist and said, Now I got to go back home and get some things I'm going to need, Mr. Leroy. Ma and Pa must be at the meeting by now, so no one won't see me. Jingle Boy picked his way through the trees heading toward my home, and I asked Mr. Leroy, How far off is this village in Michigan, sir? Ain't far at all, Eli. Less than an hour from Detroit on this here horse. How are we going to know where to look for the preacher? He ain't going to be hard to find if he there. That didn't make no sense. That didn't make no sense at all. If the preacher really had stole Mr. Leroy's money, seemed to me like he'd try to make himself real hard to find. I said, But Mr. Leroy, what if he's gone? He shot at Mr. Highgate 5 days ago. I don't think he's going to be waiting around for no one to come get him. Mr. Leroy pulled Jingle Boy to a stop. He turned round and looked in my face and said, Elijah, what you want me to say? I ain't got no other choice but to go and try to find him. I ain't got no other choice of getting my family back. You can talk all you want. We's going to Michigan. I knowed right at that second how smart my pa was. He was exactly right when he said Mr. Leroy was looking at things the way he wanted them to be, not the way they really were. But I also knowed that if I weren't there to try to think things through for Mr. Leroy, there weren't no way at all he was ever going to find the preacher. I knowed Mr. Leroy's heart was so bust up that I was going to have to do the thinking for both of us. Mr. Leroy let me off Jingle Boy a ways in the woods so I could walk up to our house. When I got there, my heart quit beating, 'cause when I pulled the door to go in, Ma and Pa were pushing it to go out. They were as surprised to see me as I was to see them. Elijah, what you doing here? Can't Mrs. Bixby watch you? Yes, ma'am. She said she can watch me any time you want. excepting she's confused and called it looking after your baby." Ma smiled and said, "Well, she don't know you too old to be called no baby, do she? We ain't gonna say nothing to her about it, though. She don't mean no harm." "Yes, ma'am." Pa said, "Answer what your ma asked, Elijah. What you doing here?" I lied. "I forgot my geometry school book and had to come back." "Well, run on in and get it, son. We's just about to leave." "Yes, sir." Doggone it all. Warn't gonna be no way to get no food nor provisions for this trip with Ma and Pa waiting on me. I went back into my bedroom and picked up another tote sack and put a book in it. I got ready to leave my room, then stopped because I got to thinking about something. Since me and Mr. Leroy were about to take a dangerous trip and he had the preacher's fancy pistol in case anything bad happened, I thought maybe I should take something along too. I put about 20 of the best chunking stones I had into the sack, then lifted the end of my mattress and pulled Mr. Taylor's sullied knife from underneath. I looked at it and let the moonlight shine off the blade. I practiced stabbing at a patty roller, then stuck it in my bag. Then I dug round in my box till I found the piece of paper that Mr. Highgate had gave to me. I looked at the name of the man who'd helped him, then stuck the paper in my pocket. I looked around my room to see if there was anything else we might use on this adventure. I didn't know what it was, but something made me start feeling a little fragile. I didn't know if it was 'cause this might be the last time I'd ever see my room again, or if it was 'cause I knowed if I did make it back, Ma and Pa were going to be out of their minds with being mad at what I'd done. I sniffed the looseness back down in my nose, then went out on the stoop. Ma said, "Everything all right, Elijah?" Doggone it all. Ma was hearing things that weren't being said again. "Yes, ma'am." Pa said, "Don't you worry, son. Things has ways of working theyselves out." "Yes, sir." I hugged my ma and pa for maybe the last time. They told me to be good and we all walked off the stoop. They went left and I went right. Mr. Leroy was still where I'd left him at the woods. He pulled me back on Jingle Boy. I took the paper with the address out of my pocket and said, "Sir, this is who we're going to look for once we get to that village in Michigan. Mr. Highgate said he's a mighty good man." For the first time I can ever remember since I've knowed him, Mr. Leroy smiled. And I can't say which looked more unnatural, him trying to smile or old Flapjack trying to run. He said, "Elijah, this here's going to turn out all right. I feel it in my heart." Me, Mr. Leroy, and Jingle Boy started heading southwest, getting ready to catch a hold of the Stealer of Dreams. All right. Well, that's the end of chapter 19 today. Sounds like Mr. Leroy and Elijah are headed off to an adventure in Michigan. Maybe tomorrow we'll find out if they catch up to the preacher and if Mr. Leroy can get some of his money back. I hope you can join me for that story tomorrow. Goodbye.